In this video I'll be going over solder. This can be quite a debated subject as to what solder you should be using, but for the context of this video I'll be keeping it as simple as possible. As usual, I'll leave references and anything else in the video description. This bit of the video I'll just be quoting the Wikipedia explanation of what solder is because it's easier. Solder is a fusible metal alloy used to create a permanent bond between metal workpieces. Solder is melted in order to adhere to and connect pieces after cooling, which requires that an alloy suitable for use as solder have a lower melting point than the pieces being joined. The solder should also be resistant to oxidative and corrosive effects that would degrade the joint over time. Solder used in making electrical connections also needs to have favourable electrical characteristics. Soft solder typically has a melting point range of 90 to 450 degrees Celsius and is commonly used in electronics, plumbing and sheet metal work. Alloys that melt between 180 and 190 degrees Celsius are the most commonly used. Soldering performed using alloys with a melting point above 450 degrees Celsius is called hard soldering, silver soldering or brazing. There's a lot more I could quote, but I'm not going to. You can read it for yourself if you want to. The link is in the description. To put all of that simply, solder is a low temperature alloy, commonly tin and something else like lead or copper. It's always worked with around 350 to 450 degrees Celsius. Anything above that is unnecessary because the solder is designed for that temperature range, and the sustained heat for electronics anyway would cause damage to the components. You may have noticed earlier when I quoted the Wikipedia page it said, melting point range of 90 to 450 degrees Celsius. Then it says, alloys that melt between 180 and 190 degrees Celsius are most commonly used. But I said we work with it around 350 to 450 degrees Celsius. I know that may be a little bit confusing, so let me clear this up. While the alloys in the solder do melt at lower temperatures depending on the mix of alloys, you need to have the temperature of the iron much hotter in order to work with it. The iron not only has to be hot enough to melt the solder, but also heat the components up at the same time for the solder to adhere properly. Otherwise you'll end up having what's known as a cold joint. As far as the types of solder go, if you start looking you may be overwhelmed with how many there are, but in reality there's only two types, lead-based or lead-free. What you'll commonly see is the different ratios of things that make up each type. These ratios are normally denoted by the periodic table letters or the chemical element symbols. Before I go any further, here's something important you need to know. Only use solder specifically for electronics. The reason I say this is because people confuse plumbing solder with electronic solder. If you're in an actual store, it should be pretty easy to get the right stuff. It'll be near the soldering irons and should say something about electronic use. But if you're buying online, I'd recommend buying from a proper electronics store in your country. The reason you don't want to get plumbing and electronic solder confused is because some of the plumbing solder can use much more aggressive flux which can damage electronic components. I'll go into more detail about flux and why plumbing solder and flux is bad to use for electronics in the next video. The first type of solder we'll talk about is lead-based. Lead-based is the traditional type of solder. It's been used basically forever because it's the easiest to work with. Lead-based solder requires lower temperatures than lead-free solder, normally around 350 degrees Celsius, so the potential for damaging components and lifting pads from excess heat is lower. The most common one you'll find is tin lead 6040, which is 60% tin and 40% lead, denoted by the letters SN for tin and PB for lead. You'll also find 6337, which is the same as 6040 but it's more eutectic. Eutectic as explained by Wikipedia. In specific proportions, some alloys are eutectic, that is, the alloy's melting point is the lowest possible for a mixture of those components and coincides with the freezing point. If that's as clear as mud to you as it is for me, let me dumb it right down. The more eutectic it is, the faster it goes from a solid to a liquid and back to a solid. I know that may not be the most scientific explanation, but it's near enough for us. When it comes to deciding between 6040 or 6337, it's personal preference, or more often than not, availability. 6040 is what I would recommend if you want to start with soldering because it's very easy to use and very easy to tell if you have a good solder joint or not. If it's good, it'll be nice and shiny. If it's bad, it'll be grainy and dull. 6040 is usually a lot easier to get than 6337 in some cases and can be cheaper. Some people may also wonder about the safety of lead-based solder seeing it has lead in it. It's fine, you won't get lead poisoning from solder unless you eat it, and even then you'd have to eat a hell of a lot of it. The reason lead-based is being phased out is because of industry and the amount of electronics that get disposed of each year. Environmentalists had a hissy fit about the potential for lead to leach into the ground, and now the industry has to use lead-free, which, subsequently, we as hobbyists are slowly being forced to use as well because of a lot of countries removing lead-based solder from sale. Lead-free has become more common over the last couple of decades or so because it's the environmentally friendly option, seeing it doesn't contain lead. That's all well and good for industry, but for hobbyists and especially for people starting out, it can actually be a bit of a pain to work with. Lead-free requires higher temperatures to work with, normally around 450 degrees Celsius, so the potential for damaging components or lifting pads is a little higher, especially when you're first starting out. This is why many people recommend lead-based for beginners. Lead-free solders have been getting easier to work with, but unlike with lead-based solders where it's very easy to see if you have a good joint or not, lead-free, especially with cheaper solders, can look grainy and dull no matter what, which makes it much harder to tell if you have a good joint. Again, this has been improving over the last few years, but it's still not perfect. Picking a lead-free solder can be quite daunting because there are so many different mixes out there. No company has found the perfect mix like with tin lead. The most common lead-free solders you'll find are tin copper. Some may say they contain a trace of cobalt. That's fine. According to studies, the cobalt helps prevent tip erosion. That should prolong the life of your tip. Stop laughing. A small note on lead-free solder. It can be more aggressive with damaging the tip of your soldering iron even with cobalt. Keep that in mind when deciding which solder to get. Another thing you'll need to consider is the diameter of the solder you want to use. This depends entirely on what you're working on and what you feel comfortable with. As a general rule, it's easier to work with smaller diameter than it is bigger. Something like 0.56mm is a good place to start, especially for PCB work. The smaller the diameter, the easier it is to control how much solder you're putting onto a joint, which makes it easier to get a good joint. With soldering, it's pretty easy to add and remove, but it's still easy to add a touch more than remove a tiny amount because you'll probably end up removing too much and have to add more again anyway. Once you work out the diameter, the next thing is the size, or more accurately, the weight of the roll of solder. If you're just starting out and want to play around, 250 gram is a decent weight. It'll take you years to work through a single roll. You could also get 500 gram, but I wouldn't recommend that, especially if you're just starting out, because they can be expensive and it's best to play around with different solders until you find something that you like. You may also see hobby-size rolls or tubes of solder which are typically 15 to 20 grams. They're not bad for just trying a solder and they're usually pretty cheap, but you'll probably find that you'll go through it pretty quickly, so unless you're really unsure or really strapped for cash, I'd recommend sticking with the small 250 gram rolls. You'll also find that some electronic kits or even soldering irons come with a small hobby-size roll of solder. That's perfectly fine to play around with, although a lot of the time its diameter is slightly too big, usually close to 1mm or bigger. You can still play around with it, but just know it'll be easy to add too much to a joint because of the bigger diameter, and it's normally not the best quality. I know a lot of people will want me to go into brands of solder, what's good, what's bad, and what I would recommend. Now I want to make this clear. I have no brand loyalty at all. I don't care what the brand is, as long as it works. I also won't talk about brands I haven't personally used or tested for extended periods, and by that I mean months or years. In saying that, the brands I've been using for years are MG Chemicals, Loctite and Multicore. They all work well. I've been using MG Chemicals 6337 because I prefer 6337 more, but I have 6040 in Loctite and Multicore and use them as well with no issues. Don't just go out and buy what I use. Get what you can as cheap as you can. Play around with different brands, types and mixes of solder and see how they work for you. Some people like myself prefer 6337, others hate it. Some love lead-free, others can't stand working with it. At the end of the day, once you practice a little bit and learn how solder works, they'll all do the same thing and you'll be able to use anything. It simply comes down to personal preference and what you find works best for you. As a final word, you might also see lead-based or lead-free solder with other things like silver in it. 9 times out of 10 you won't need it, especially if you're just starting out. Solder with silver in it tends to be more expensive than standard tin lead or tin copper. I'm about to annoy a lot of people with what I'm going to say next, but it needs to be said. Audiophiles will say you must have solder with silver in it, and it must have a high content of silver if you care about your audio at all. That you'll get the best and cleanest signal if all the solder joints are done with solder containing a high content of silver. Sorry to say, but if it's digital audio, USB, HDMI, etc., it doesn't matter at all. Digital signals don't care one bit what solder is used, it's just ones and zeros after all. Analog signals, perhaps if you're being really nitpicky and have a very high quality system with high quality audio sources, but really at the end of the day, as long as it's a good joint, it'll work fine regardless of if you use solder with silver in it or not. There are very few times when you'll ever have to use anything other than standard solder, and if you ever have to, by then you'll know what type of solder you'll need and you won't be watching these basic videos anyway. Soldering is all about making an electrical connection. As long as it's a good joint, it'll work. Doesn't matter if it's a tiny LED, a high current power supply, some speaker cables, a good connection is far more important than the type of solder you're using. In the next video, we'll talk about flux.